Some houses don't want guests. Some houses don't sleep, and once you step inside, neither will you. Tonight, join me as we enter the house on Hallow Creek Road, a place of whispers, shadows, and games that never end. This is the house that never sleeps. Sit back, turn off the lights, and listen. If you dare. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding like a pale ribbon through the hills. Adam kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the fading line of asphalt that disappeared into the woods. The sun was slipping down the horizon, bleeding red and orange across the sky. But the deeper he drove into the countryside, the more the light seemed to wither, swallowed by the trees that leaned in from both sides. He had left the city hours ago, trading its constant hum of traffic, voices, and neon for silence. At first, the quiet had been soothing an escape, but now, as the miles dragged on and his phone lost signal, the silence felt heavy. His own breathing sounded too loud in the car. The ticking of the engine unnerved him. He turned on the radio only to find static on every station. The landlord had been vague when they'd spoken over the phone. "It's an old place," the man had said, his voice raspy, dismissive. "Stone walls, strong foundation. You'll have the peace you need for your writing." When Adam had asked why the rent was so cheap, the man had simply chuckled. "Old houses have old reputations. People talk. You're a writer, you'll understand." Now, as the road narrowed into gravel, Adam wondered what exactly those reputations were. The GPS had long since failed him. All he had was a set of handwritten directions. "Follow Hallow Creek Road until you see the stone gates. The house is at..." The trees parted at last, revealing a clearing bathed in the last light of dusk. There, at the end of a winding dirt path, stood the house. Adam slowed the car to a crawl, his mouth going dry. It was enormous, older than anything he had ever seen. Its stone walls were blackened with age, the roof sagging in places. Tall windows stared down from the second floor like blind eyes. Weeds choked the yard, creeping up the walls and twisting around the porch posts. A single chimney jutted into the sky, leaning slightly as if tired of standing. The house looked less like a home and more like a tomb. Adam pulled up near the gate and killed the engine. For a long time, he didn't move. His fingers drummed nervously against the steering wheel. Every instinct told him to turn around, to drive back the way he came. But then he thought of the half-finished manuscript waiting on his laptop, the months of writer's block, the publishers growing impatient. He needed this He needed quiet. He needed isolation. Grabbing his duffel bag from the passenger seat, Adam stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. The air here was colder, damp, carrying the scent of moss and something faintly metallic. He glanced at the neighboring houses, or rather, the absence of them. The nearest home was far down the road, its windows faintly lit. Too far to hear him if he screamed. As he walked toward the porch, he felt eyes on him. He turned sharply and caught sight of movement, a curtain being drawn in that distant neighbor's window. Whoever lived there had been watching. Adam raised a hand in greeting, but the curtain stayed closed. His stomach tightened. The porch groaned under his weight as he climbed the steps. The front door loomed tall and heavy, its wood scarred with cracks. The key the landlord had mailed him felt too cold in his hand, as if it had been sitting in ice. He slid it into the lock. The sound of the tumblers clicking open echoed far too loudly in the silence. He hesitated, his heart pounding. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the knob. The door creaked open. Inside, the air hit him like a woolstale, thick and sour, as though the house hadn't been opened in decades. Dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight, drifting like ash. The foyer stretched before him, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. A chandelier hung crookedly overhead, its crystals dulled with grime. Adam stepped inside. The door shut behind him with a hollow thud. The sound of the door closing seemed to echo through the house longer than it should have. Adam froze, his duffel bag still slung over one shoulder, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The silence that followed was so absolute it pressed against his ears, making him feel as though he had stepped underwater. He took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath his boot, the sound ricocheting through the empty space. He swept the flashlight across the foyer. To the left, a parlor stretched into shut, the shapes of furniture hidden under yellowed sheets. To the right, a dining room with a long wooden table, warped and scarred, sat like a relic of another century. He told himself this was just an old house. Old houses made noises. Old houses smelled strange. Old houses felt heavy. That didn't mean anything was wrong. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. His gaze flicked toward the staircase that rose directly in front of him. It spiraled upward into darkness, each step covered in a thin layer of dust. Cobwebs stretched between the banister rails like lace, swaying slightly in the draft. His skin prickled. He forced himself to move into the sitting room near the front of the house. A cracked leather armchair sat beneath the window, its glass smeared with grime. He dropped his duffel bag beside it and exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. "This is fine," he muttered. His voice sounded too loud in the silence, bouncing off the walls and returning to him like an echo. "You just need to get used to it. That's all." He pulled out his notebook from the bag, setting it on the small table beside the chair. The sight of the blank pages usually stirred something inside him, possibility, anticipation. Tonight, however, the emptiness felt oppressive, like the house itself was daring him to try. His stomach growled. He realized he hadn't eaten since he'd stopped for gas hours ago. He dug a sandwich from his bag, unwrapped it, and chewed in silence. Every bite seemed too loud. Halfway through, a sound stopped him. A creak. Faint, deliberate. Adam froze, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted toward the staircase again. The flashlight beam caught the first few steps, but beyond that was nothing but blackness. He waited, listened. Silence. He forced a laugh and shook his head. Get. But when he glanced at his sandwich again, he realized his hand was trembling. He finished eating quickly, shoved the wrapper back into his bag, and tried to focus on his notebook. The pen hovered over the page but refused to move. His thoughts were a jumble half story ideas, half nervous imaginings about what might be hiding upstairs. Hours passed like that. The house remained still, silent, but the unease never left. Every time his eyes drooped shut, some faint sound would jolt him awake, a groan of wood, a faint shuffle, the distant drip of water. When at last exhaustion overcame him, Adam curled into the armchair, his jacket pulled tight around him. The flashlight lay across his chest, its beam dimming as the batteries wore down. His final thought before sleep claimed him was that he should have listened to the old woman across the street, the one who'd closed her curtains so quickly when he arrived. Because, in the silence that followed, as Adam drifted into uneasy dreams, the house seemed to exhale, and somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open on its own. He woke to darkness and the ache in his neck that always came from sleeping in a chair. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The smell damp wood, cold stone, something faintly acrid brought it back. The house, the long drive, the door closing on its own. The flashlight had rolled into his lap in the night. He clicked it and got a thin, tired circle of light. The lantern he'd planned to use was still in the duffel. He pulled it out, struck the flint, and coaxed a small flame to life beneath the glass. The glow pushed the shadows back, just enough to see the outlines of the room. The armchair, the window smudged with grime, the doorway to the foyer yawning like a mouth. Something creaked overhead. Adam held still. The sound didn't come again. He told himself it was the roof. Wind. Settling wood. He stood, stretched, and felt dust flake from his sleeves. He needed water. Coffee. Food that wasn't a gas station sandwich. He needed to make the place livable enough that his brain would stop inventing footsteps. The kitchen was at the back of the house. He found it by following the smell of old ash and the feeling of cooler air. The lantern's glow slid along a long counter marred by knife cuts and burn rings. A farm sink stained a permanent brown. Cupboards whose doors sagged from their hinges. A metal clock on the wall had stopped at 2:37. He tapped it with a knuckle. The hands refused to move. He found a stack of plates with a coat of dust, a drawer of mismatched cutlery, a kettle with a dented side. The stove was a relic, all iron and stubborn knobs. He twisted one as an experiment and heard gases somewhere in its throat. He turned it off quickly. The back door had a window set into it, and beyond that he could make out the yard a half-collapsed shed. The pale line of the creek this road was named for. He unlatched the door and stepped out into wet morning air. Birds were the sky was the pale gray that promised the day would never quite brighten. He drew a breath that tasted like metal and stone, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the urge to leave eased by a sliver. There was a tired peace here under the roar. He circled the shed. Inside, a rusted lawn roller, a coil of hose hardened into its shape, a box of bent nails, a crate of old bottles. A wooden crate stenciled with letters so faded he had to tilt it to the light Hallow & Sons. Glass. He found a broom head with no handle and a hammer with a split grip. He took the hammer anyway. Back in the kitchen, he tried the taps. They coughed, wheezed, then spat a stuttering stream the color of weak tea. He let it run until it cleared, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. He cracked a window to let the gas smell out and said aloud, "Don't blow me up, okay?" The house did not answer. He ate, standing at the sink, an apple, a heel of bread, the coffee when it finally boiled. Heat climbed through him, steadying his hands. When he de-scraped away the worst of the dust from the table and wiped a strip of counter clean enough for a notebook, he allowed himself a circuit of the downstairs. He moved slowly, lantern first, and let the house unfold. The parlor with its furniture shrouded and a piano whose keys showed through a torn sheet like teeth. The dining room, a long, scarred table, 8 chairs, a sideboard with a cracked mirror over it. A study tucked behind folding doors, books collapsed sideways on the shelves, a leather blotter with a stain shaped like a country on a map. Everywhere he went, he found the same film of neglect, the same stillness that was less absence of sound than a weight on top of it. In the foyer, the chandelier swayed when he passed beneath, a gesture like a nod. No breeze touched his face. He took the stairs. Halfway up, he paused and looked down. The lantern made a small island in a sea of dark. He thought of the landlord's voice on the phone. Stone walls, strong foundation. You'll have the peace you need. There had been something else, a catch in the laugh. Old houses have old reputations. People talk. He had filed the tone away then as small-town superstition. Now the words felt like a door he hadn't opened. At the landing he found a hall that ran the length of the house, doors set at irregular intervals, the ceiling low enough that he could lay a palm against it and feel the chill locked in the plaster. He tried the first door, a bedroom. Iron bed frame bare of a mattress, a wardrobe standing open with a wire hanger twisted into a question mark. The wallpaper here had a repeating blue fern that had bled into its neighbor like ink in rain. The next room held a dresser with 3 drawers stuck at odd angles, a mirror crazed with a lightning bolt crack. His face in it looked like it had been cut and badly put back together. He snorted and looked away. He saved the door at the end of the hall for last. It sat a little crooked in its frame. The knob was black with tarnish. When he closed his hand around it, the cold traveled up his arm like a needle. He twisted. It did not turn. He tried again. He set his weight into it. The door held, with a noise under the knob like teeth grinding. He examined the old hardware with the lantern held close. The keyhole had been packed with something long ago, soft metal, maybe, or wood. He felt the faintest draw toward it, as if the door radiated a breath. He set the lantern down. pressed his ear to the seam. At first, there was nothing but the big sound of his own blood. Then, a difference, the sense of a room on the other side, smaller than this hall, holding its air like a chest held tight against a sob. He stepped back suddenly, breath caught halfway to his lungs. He told himself he'd bring oil, tools, daylight, and someone else. He told himself a lot of things on the walk back down the hall. At the bottom of the stairs he stopped, uncertain why. The front door was as he'd left it, deadbolt thrown, chain loose against the wood. He crossed the foyer and checked the chain anyway. It moved freely, cold against his fingers. He turned to the sitting room and the armchair he slept in, and only then noticed the small thing on the table beside the notebook, a speck of chalk-white grit that had NT been there before. He pinched it up. Plaster dust. He rubbed it between finger and thumb and felt how fine it was, how new. He lifted his gaze to the ceiling. A hairline crack chased the ceiling from one corner of the room to the other, a path he was certain had not existed when he'd drifted off. He waited for the house to make a sound to explain itself. It did not. He gathered his laptop from the duffel, set it on the table, and tried to anchor himself to the thing he'd come here for. The keys felt unfamiliar. He typed a title, Hallow Creek. He typed a line, then he deleted it. He typed another and left it alone despite how wrong it read. He wrote for an hour, then another. Sentences that felt like they strained across a gap, thoughts that fell short of the far bank. When he looked up, the room had gone dim. He checked the time on his phone and found the screen black battery dead. Or perhaps it had simply given up trying to be useful out here. He lit 2 candles he found in a drawer in the sideboard and set them at the edges of the table, little citadels against the dusk. Somewhere deeper in the house, something ticked, not the stopped kitchen clock. A gentler sound, like a small metal tongue striking a bell. He followed it into the dining room. On the sideboard sat a clock under a glass dome, the kind whose pendulum is a brass ball that spins rather than swings. The dome was opaque, with grime. The clock face, the color of nicotine. He wiped a little porthole into the glass with his sleeve and peered in. The hands pointed to 2:37. He laughed, too loudly in the hush. "Join the club," he told it. He tapped the dome with the back of his knuckle. The clock began to tick. He took his hand back fast enough to bump his elbow on the mirror, which gave him a tilted version of himself with a candle stuck to his shoulder like a wound. He waited, cheeks warming with foolishness. The brass ball spun. The tick held for 7 beats, 8, 9, then wound down to silence. The ball slowed to stillness. He replaced the dust on the dome with a gesture that felt like undoing a mistake, and went back to the sitting room. When the candles guttered, he trimmed their wicks with the pocket knife he hadn't realized he'd been gripping. He ate his second apple. He drank water that tasted faintly like the pipes it had traveled through. He read a page of a book he didn't really see. He told himself, "Tonight you sleep upstairs, the way a parent tells a child. Tonight you stop waking me." But when he climbed the stairs with the lantern in one hand and his bag in the other, the dark at the top of the landing felt solid. In the bedroom with the iron bed frame, he spread a blanket over the springs and lay down fully clothed, lantern turned low on the floor. He arranged his notebook and a pencil-like talismans within reach. He stared at the ceiling until the crack that wasn't there in this room blurred. He thought he'd lie awake for hours, listening for the house to move, He slept almost at once, as if someone had taken him by the back of the neck and pressed him gently into the surface of the world. He dreamed of water running under stone, of a river that made no sound, of leaves that turned their undersides to him like palms asking. He dreamed of a narrow door with a black keyhole filled in with wax. He woke with his heart pounding and didn't know why. Silence lay on the room like a folded blanket. The lantern had burned down to a coal red eye. He sat up and groped for the matches, touched heat, hissed a breath through his teeth. He found a match by feel, struck it, and set the lantern wick alight again. There on the floor, beside the bed frame, lay tracks he had not made. Not footprints. 4 short lines in a row. Then a space. Then 4 again. The marks ran from beside the lantern to the corner where the wall met the wardrobe. Adam held the lantern lower. Mouse! He told himself too quickly, mouse dragging a foot. He followed the marks to the corner. The baseboard there had a gap where a strip of wood had shrunk away from the plaster. A pale dust had sifted out and built up in a little drift. He knelt and saw something else at the edge of the drift, 2 strands of hair stuck to the paint by static. They were fine and pale, no longer than the width of 2 of his fingers. He stood too fast and bumped the lantern against the wardrobe so hard its door yawned and then swung closed like a nod. He forced a laugh that broke in the middle and set the lantern on the floor to keep his hands from shaking the flame to a tremble. He slept again, badly, until the room found its gray morning. He woke stiff and dry-mouthed and thirsty. The light through the window made the dust in the air look like a snow that had lost interest in falling. He went downstairs for water and to put coffee on and to prove that the night had been a trick of nerves and body chemistry. In the kitchen, he paused with his hand on the kettle. The clock on the wall, 2:37. The clock under the dome, 2:37. His phone, when he plugged it into the wall and it blinked itself awake. 2:37 on the lock screen, frozen under low power mode like a label. He packed the image away with care and refused to look too long at any of it. He took his coffee to the back steps and sat with the mug cupped in both hands. A ribbon of fog lay along the creek. Somewhere across the field, a dog barked 3 times as if ticking a box and went quiet. He could make out the neighbor's house through the bare trees. A pale rectangle, windows unlit, the curtain that had moved last night hung still. He told himself that if he stayed, he would learn the routine sounds, the housemaid, and stop hearing them as speech. He told himself that if he left, some smaller, meaner part of him would always think he defled, not a building but a test he defailed before taking. He put the empty mug on the step and said, "All right," to the yard. He spent the afternoon doing the work of making a shell feel like it might forgive being used again. He took the sheets off the furniture in the parlor and folded them into a stack that left a clean square on the floor. Under the sheet, the piano's keys were yellowed and 2 were missing their caps. When he laid a finger on C, the note came thin and then warmed, as if surprised that anyone cared how it sounded. He swept the foyer and raised a small cloud that made his throat itch. He found a fuse box behind a panel in the study and flipped every switch, and learned that the only lights that still functioned were 2 in the hall downstairs, and 1 in the kitchen, the one that hummed and shed a color like old honey. He took the shade off that bulb and wiped it and put it back and felt a foolish satisfaction at the difference. He made lists. Oil the hinges. Replace the bulb in the foyer if it will forgive me. Buy traps without killing if possible. Ask in town about a man to clean chimneys. Find a hardware store. He wrote, called the landlord, and then drew a line through it. He didn't intend. He ate at the dining room table with the chair turned so he could see the doorway, because his back refused any other argument. He told himself stories that began with, he woke in a house where all the clocks had stopped at the same minute, and ended with nothing worth keeping. He stacked the plates and carried them to the sink and found his feet wouldn't lift when he meant them to, as if the floor had learned the rhythm of his steps and decided to play along. He went out at dusk and stood in the yard and let the last light find every crack in the stone and every missing slate in the roof. He watched the neighbor's window. It held no face. When he came back in, the front door caught on something before it closed. He looked down and saw a folded piece of paper that had not been there when he left. He lifted it and found it was not paper, but a page torn from a ledger, thick and lined. Writing covered one side in a hand so small and neat it might have been drawn. He read it standing in the foyer. We hear it. We pretend we do not. The children hear it, and it knows they do. If you are reading this, you think you are alone. You are not. Do not go upstairs at night. Do not open the room at the end of the hall. Do not answer if it speaks your name. No signature. No date. The bottom edge looked as if it had been ripped and then gnawed by mice. He flipped it over. On the blank side, someone had drawn the outline of the house in 4 lines and shaded the windows on the second floor entirely black. He set the page on the table and stood with his fingers pressed into the wood until the sting made him pull them away. Then he folded the page again and put it in the notebook. And then he took it out of the notebook and put it in his back pocket like that would make a difference. He did not go upstairs right away when darkness laid its hand on the house. He lit the 2 working bulbs and the lantern and 3 candles and read the page a second time and a third, looking for the place where a joke or a misunderstanding would reveal itself. He went to the front door and examined the threshold for marks where someone might have slid the page beneath. The dust there was disturbed. He couldn't say if it was new. When he could no longer stand the way the house seemed to listen to his movements, he climbed the stairs for the second night and chose a different bedroom, as if that changed the rule. He set the lantern on the floor, the notebook and pencil at arm's reach. He tucked the ledger page under the corner of his pillow, because he could not explain why that made him feel less like a mark on a chalkboard. He did not sleep at once. He lay and counted his breaths. At 50, he started again. At 100, his eyelids lost their weight. And at 120, he heard a sound and sat upright without remembering the part between lying and rising. It was the sound of a glass touching wood. In the hall, soft, unhurried, like the way someone sets down a drink when a conversation turns to something they'd rather not say. Adam eased off the bed frame. The spring sighed, even with his care. He carried the lantern to the door and opened it half the width of his shoulder. The hall was empty. The dark beyond the circle of the lantern was not. It held the sense of things in it if one only could adjust one's eyes. He waited until the small muscle beneath his right eye stopped twitching. He stepped into the hall. 3 paces. 4. He had left the door to the end room as he'd found it unlocked. Knob stubborn. He stood outside it and listened and listened and listened. Somewhere in the house, a clock that did not run struck Once, he returned to the bedroom and slid the bolt, which he hadn't noticed earlier had been installed at some point above the knob. He set the lantern down and remembered a second after the flame crackled that fire and this splintered wood might not love each other. He moved it to the floorboards clear of things that would carry a flame like a relay. He slept. He learned that his body could fall when his mind was still standing. He dreamed he was in the kitchen and the tap would not stop running and the water rose and would not let him reach the window. He woke with his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The house, in the dark before dawn, breathed in. Adam held his breath with it. From the hall, a whisper crossed the wood like a finger drawn down a harp string. Not a word. Not yet. He did not move. The sound did not come again. He lay awake until the gray unstitched the darkness, and the house found its day shape and the breath he had been holding since he set foot on the porch left him. As if someone had pulled the stopper from a bottle, he sat up, reached beneath the pillow for the folded ledger page, and found nothing. He lifted the pillow, turned it over. He checked the floor, the crack between the floorboards, the pocket of his jeans where he remembered very clearly putting the page before, not trusting his memory and sliding it under his head. He didn't. He laughed softly, which sounded like crying with the volume turned down. He stood, dressed, and went looking as if a lost piece of paper could be found in a house with this many lips to hide behind. He checked the sitting room, the table, the study, the piano's music stand. He went to the foyer last because he already knew. The page lay on the floorboards under the chandelier, unfolded, face up. A small footprint stamped in dust across the drawn windows upstairs. The print was the size of a child's hand. He leaned down and pressed his thumb next to it. His thumb looked obscene beside it, like a shoe left next to a bare foot. He brushed the dust aside and felt the cool of the wood through his skin. He folded the page very carefully and put it back in his pocket. He left it there and didn't take it out again. He straightened in, with the carefulness of a man deciding something that will not be undecided, said to the empty air, "I won't go upstairs at night. I won't open the room at the end of the hall. I won't answer." The house held still. He added, "Not tonight." He added nothing else. He went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and thought of how many beginnings a man can be allowed. Before he is only a person collecting first lines, the kettle began to whisper. He put his hand on the burner and felt the faintest tremor travel up from the iron, as if a heart had decided to be a machine and would be forgiven for not knowing how. He took his hand away and watched the window over the sink. The fog on the creek broke into pieces and drifted out of the frame. Behind him, in the dining room, the clock under glass began to tick. He did not turn. He waited for the water to boil and poured it, and when the clock wound down, as he knew it would, the silence that returned was not a relief. It was a rope loosening and waiting to be lifted again. He carried his coffee to the table. He opened a notebook to the last line and wrote beneath it, with a hand he did not quite recognize as his own, "Night falls differently here." He put a period after here, because that was the only thing in the sentence that did not feel like a guess. And upstairs, at the end of the hall, the locked door said nothing at all. Adam tried to convince himself that the strangeness of the first days would fade that. Soon the house would become ordinary, just walls and dust and silence. But by the third night, the silence itself had become unbearable. He lay in the upstairs bedroom, lantern turned low, the ledger page still heavy in his pocket like a talisman. He had sworn not to open the locked door, not to answer if the house spoke his name, yet he could not shake the feeling that he had already failed some unspoken rule simply by being here. The house was waiting. At first, the sounds were faint, a creak in the floorboards. 2 rooms over, a sigh of wind that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than outside. Adam pressed his face into the pillow and told himself it was nothing. Then came the footsteps. Soft, careful. Pacing the hallway, he sat upright, every muscle locked. The lantern threw a weak circle of light across the cracked plaster, leaving the corners to the dark. The footsteps moved closer. He could almost picture it bare feet dragging just slightly, pausing between each step, as if testing the boards. He stood, gripping the lantern so tightly the metal burned his palm. He opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped. But the silence that followed was worse, charged with a tension, as if the dark itself were leaning toward him. "Hello?" he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. The answer came instantly, a whisper from the far end of the hall, soft as a breath. Adam. The sound hollowed his chest. His name had never sounded so strange, stretched thin as though pulled from a mouth that had forgotten how to shape it. He slammed the door shut and threw the bolts. His breath came fast, loud in the stillness. He told himself he would not answer again. He pressed his hands over his ears. The whisper seeped through anyway, closer this time, just beyond the door. His knees buckled. He staggered back until his shoulders hit the wardrobe. The lantern flame flickered, shivering shadows across the ceiling. He clutched the ledger page in his pocket, feeling the fragile crease of it under his fingers. He did not sleep. At some hour before dawn, the whisper ceased. The silence that replaced it was so complete that Adam thought, absurdly, he had gone deaf. But then the faintest sound reached him, water dripping steadily, rhythmically, as though from a faucet left open. Adam. He followed it in the morning light, when the world was less threatening. Downstairs, into the kitchen. The faucet was dry. The sound came from the dining room. There, on the long scarred table, sat a glass of water, half full, clear, perfectly still. Adam stared until his eyes watered. He had not put it there. And on the sideboard, the clock under glass ticked, though its hands never moved past 37. He circled the table slowly, the lantern light stretching his shadow long across the warped wood. The glass of water sat in the center as if someone had just stepped out of the room and meant to return. He bent low, studying it. The surface did not ripple, though the air in the room felt restless, shifting against his skin. He reached out a finger and touched the rim. The glass was cold, too cold, as though it had been pulled from deep underground. He jerked his hand back. Behind him, the sideboard mirror caught the candlelight and reflected the scene back. Adam hunched over the glass, his face pale, eyes wide. But there was something wrong in the reflection. The glass in the mirror was full, brimming nearly to the lip, water trembling as if something inside it wanted out. Adam spun around. The real glass was still half full, perfectly still. The whisper slid through the room, curling around the chandelier and crawling down the walls. Drink. His throat constricted. The word had been clear this time, not just his name, but a command, spoken low and urgent. No, he rasped. His own voice sounded foreign. No, I won't. The silence that followed was colder than the word itself. He grabbed the glass, carried it to the sink, and dumped the water out. It struck the basin with a hiss that sounded almost alive. He left the glass upside down to drain and forced himself away from the room, heart hammering. 4 hours afterward, the taste of metal lingered on his tongue. By afternoon, the house felt different again. Not louder, quieter, almost expectant. Adam tried to focus on his notebook at the sitting room table. He wrote sentence after sentence, but every time he looked up, he was certain the pages had rearranged themselves. Words he didn't remember writing strung between his own. One line caught his attention, scrawled in his hand but unfamiliar. The children are awake. He dropped the pen. His breath quickened. He hadn't written that. He would swear it. The air shifted above him. He looked up at the ceiling and saw a faint bulge in the plaster, a swell that moved slowly as if something inside pressed outward. The bulge stretched, cracked, then stilled. Dust sifted down in a thin veil over his notebook. The whisper came again, from everywhere and nowhere. Adam. This time, it was a chorus. Not one voice, but several, layered and broken. Children and women and men, all overlapping until the sound was less word than vibration. His name rattled through the boards, through the glass in the windows, through his bones. He clamped his hands over his ears and shouted, "Stop!" The voices ceased, but in the sudden silence, Adam realized he was no longer alone in the room. The leather armchair across from him empty, all morning now sagged slightly underweight. The sheet that had once covered it had slipped to the floor. In the dim lantern light, he could just make out the impression of someone sitting, knees angled, head tilted toward him. The outline did not move. Adam backed away until his shoulders struck the doorframe. He blinked, and the chair was empty again. That night, he refused to sleep upstairs. He bolted the sitting room door, set the lantern on the table, and stretched out on the floor with a blanket. His body ached with tension, every muscle tight. At some hour past midnight, he woke to the sound of soft scratching. It came from the wolf's tiny claws or fingers dragging over plaster. He held still, barely breathing. The scratching circled the room, low and deliberate, tracing the outline of his prison. Then, the whisper returned, brushing against his ear, so close he felt the breath of it. "Let us in," Adam screamed, stumbling upright. The lantern nearly toppling, he pressed his back to the wall, teeth chattering. The house sighed, floorboards rising and settling like lungs beneath him. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut with bone-shaking force, and in that echo, Adam understood the truth. The house wasn't haunted by echoes of the dead. The house itself was awake. The following day, Adam left the house for the first time since he'd arrived, clutching the ledger page like a passport. He needed people. Anything that reminded him of the world outside. The streets of town were quiet. The shop windows shuttered, though it was only noon at the corner cafe. Conversation hushed when he entered. The handful of patrons stared openly, then returned to their cups. The woman at the counter, apron dusted with flour, looked him over without greeting. "You're the one in Hallow Creek," she said flatly. Adam nodded, throat dry. "Yes? The old house?" she frowned. "You should leave it." Her tone left no room for argument. She poured him a coffee without asking, slid it across the counter, and walked away. He sat, listening to the murmurs around him. Snatches of words carried just enough for him to catch. Another one never lasts long. They always hear it sooner or later. When he turned, the table of old men by the window fell silent. One crossed himself. Another spat into his napkin. Adam drained the bitter coffee and fled back into the daylight. But even there, among living people, the whisper clung to him. Faint at first, carried on the breeze, then louder, more insistent as he neared the house again. "Adam," the voice followed him up the gravel drive, through the overgrown yard, across the porch steps. It was waiting inside, patient, hungry. By the time he shut the door behind him, the whisper had become laughter, low, soft, endless laughter that echoed through every wall. And for the first time, Adam realized he could not remember what his own laugh sounded like. That night, he tried one last act of defiance. He stuffed his ears with tissue, wrapped his head in a blanket, and lay on the floor by the fireless hearth. He told himself he would not hear it, but the voices did not need ears. The whisper slid into his thoughts like a knife into water. He felt it behind his eyes, pressing words into his mind as though they were his own. "Open the room. Let us out. We are so thirsty." Adam ripped the blanket from his head and shouted until his throat was raw. He hurled the lantern against the wall, shattering the glass, plunging the room into darkness. The laughter swelled, triumphant. And in that darkness, Adam swore he saw small shapes moving along the floor, darting just beyond reach of his trembling hands. Shadows the size of children, their whispers weaving together into a single word that would haunt him forever. "Stay." The house exhaled, and Adam knew he already had. Morning arrived, thin and reluctant, a watery light that made the dust look like ash drifting in a slow tide. Adam held to his promise for as long as a cup of coffee lasts. He washed the mug, dried it with the cleanest corner of a rag, set it on the counter with a care that felt ceremonial, then went to the shed for tools. The hammer's split handle bit his palm. He found a narrow chisel, a box of rusted screws, a slotted screwdriver whose tip had been ground to a blunt tongue. He added a paint scraper, a jackknife, a coil of twine. He told himself he was making a list, not a decision. The list happened to look like a decision. On the landing, the hall carried the cool of the creek. The house seemed to watch him approach the end door without comment. The knob was a black coin in his hand. He pressed his ear to the seam again and heard nothing but the architecture of silence. "It's just wood," he said, because that was a sentence a person could hold in both hands. He set the chisel's edge to the strike blade and tapped. The sound rang clean as a bell in the narrow hall. Flakes of paint came away like scabs. He tapped again, harder. The lock, packed with whatever had sealed it a lifetime ago, gave an inch and a fraction. He felt it in the wood through the bones in his wrist. On the third blow, something inside the mechanism sighed. He twisted the knob, expecting the same stubborn refusal. It turned. The latch stuck, as if chewing. He lifted the door with his knee, found the angle, and the latch withdrew with a sound like a tooth sliding from gum. Cold fell out of the space beyond as if he'd opened a cellar. Not the draft of winter cold like withheld breath. He lifted the lantern and stepped in. The room was smaller than it should have been, narrower than the width of the hall had implied, as though the walls had crept inward in the dark. Wallpaper peeled in long, curled tongues, revealing brown plaster beneath old water scars like the outline of continents. The air smelled of dampened old iron, and beneath it, something sweet turned wrong. He moved the lantern slowly. A broken chair hunched in the corner. A narrow table stood against the far wall, its top scored with a child's knife's idea of letters. Along the baseboard, something like chalk dust had gathered in drifts. He set the lantern on the floor. The light flattened the room, dragged the shadows long. He squatted and ran a fingertip through the dust. Not chalk, plaster ground to flour, chased with something fine as thread. He lifted the thread to the light. Hair. Pale. 2 hairs crossed like a careless X. He swallowed and looked at the table, the scored letters resolved with patient attention. Badly carved words, done at different heights, by different hands. Let me out. Hush. ITL, not at night. At the edge of the table lay a small object he had taken for a knot of shadow. He put his hand to it before sense caught up. Cloth. Stiff. He pinched and lifted. A child's dress collar, ripped free. The lace gone brown with time. The lantern's flame guttered, then steadied. He stood so fast, the chair's split rung snapped under his boot. "Okay," he said to the door. His voice sounded like it had lost its echo somewhere between his chest and the hinge. He wanted to step out and close the door and hammer the lock and be a man with a line he had anti-cross. Instead, he looked up. The ceiling bowed. A shallow swell. In the swell, a hairline crack ran east to west. Below it, someone had drawn a hopscotch grid on the floorboards in white. The boxers narrow, the numbers careful. The chalk circles at the top made a stone, or something the size of 1, sat in the first square. As if waiting its turn, he bent to pick it up. It was not a stone. It was a button, mother of pearl, worn flat on one side from long friction. He placed it back in the square with more care than he would have given a relic. He straightened, and that was when the whisper came. Not from the hall, not from the walls, but up from the floor. "Don't step The word barely feathered his skin, but it emptied his lungs. He froze with his weight halfway toward the first square. The hopscotch grid lay between him and the lantern like a trap baited with a game. He stepped sideways around it, hip to the wall, the lantern's circle of light turning with him. In the light's edge, the far corner showed something he had missed. A low trunk cachalo. On the lid, a decal clung in scraps. 2 children, a hoop, a dog with a bow. He stood, decided, and lifted the latch. Inside lay a parish of small possessions. A music box with a missing key, a comb with 3 teeth, a row of marbles like planets, a stack of folded paper as delicate as onion skin. The top paper had writing in ink faded to the color of tea. He drew it out and held it to the light. We are not bad. We did not do a bad thing. The house wants a game. The game hurts. If you hear it, you must not say your name. If you say it, it belongs to you. No signature. A sketch beneath, done in a child SHE hand. The outline of the house with the upstairs windows shaded dark, and a circle in the middle of the attic like an eye. The back of Adam's neck prickled cold. He slid the paper back into the stack and closed the trunk. The lantern's flame narrowed a thin blue tongue, then burned tall again as if breathing. He noticed then the room had a window, a small one, high, the sort meant for air more than light. It had been bricked up from the outside, mortar spilled like frozen drips. Someone had tried to scratch a hole through it from within. Their work had gotten as far as 2 finger widths of crumbly stone and then stopped. The whisper returned, low as a cat's purr. Close it, it said. Adam's skin crawled. Close what? The answer came the way a draft comes, from no single direction in all of them. The door. He turned. The door he had cracked and eased open had drifted wider while he bent over the trunk as if nudged by a breath. The hall beyond looked artificially far away, perspective stretched in a painter's trick. The darkness sat in it like a body. He stepped backward, reached for the knob, and pulled the door toward the jamb. It met the frame with a practiced fit. The latch fell into place with a sound like satisfaction. When he tried the knob a second later, because of course he did, the latch would not lift. He waited for panic and found discipline instead, the kind that had gotten him through long years of failing to write and pretending not to mind. He set his back to the door and let the room exist around him in layers he could name. Table, hopscotch, trunk, bricked window, chair. He breathed through his nose until the breath found its way back to the part of his body that knew how to be calm. Let me out, he said. Not to the house, not to anything, but to the mechanism of stuck things. Two wood swollen by weather and the iron that remembered being ore. He put his shoulder to the panel and felt the give that said this was a problem with a method. He lifted on the knob and pushed in and then out, and the latch yielded half a hair. He did it again and again, lift, in, out until the wedge he wanted to break broke with a small, shamed sound. The door opened. The hall looked ordinary again. He stepped into it, put the lantern on the floor, and closed the door. He did not relock it. He carried the lantern halfway down the hall before his feet stopped without his consent. He turned. He went back. He set the chisel against the keyhole and drove it in with 2 hard blows. Wood filled the space where a key would go. He withdrew the chisel. The keyhole looked intact. It was not at night, he said to the empty house. Not ever. The house did not disagree. It did not need to. He slept that night downstairs and woke twice first time to the sound of something small tapping on wood as if counting. The second time to the sound of the music box in the trunk trying to turn without its key, a whine that lifted the hair along his arms and faded like embarrassment when he lit the lantern. At dawn, he took his coffee to the back step and made a catalog of reasons to leave. By the bottom of the mug, the reasons had shuffled themselves into a list of scenes he should write. While they were still the kind that could be told from the outside, he went in, sat at the table, and wrote the hopscotch grid into a paragraph too careful to be true. When the clock under glass ticked once, he didn't look. He knew better than to go back that day. He went back. That day, he brought a mask he'd found in the shed, a thing meant for paint. Its rubber cracked but not useless. A set of rags, a bottle of vinegar, and a determination dressed as routine. He told himself he would inventory and nothing more. The house allowed him this lie. The door accepted his hand as if it had always intended to. The room's cold had deepened. The sweet, wrong smell had found a partner. The smell of singed hair. He didn't look for where it came from. He knelt to the trunk. He worked through its contents with an archivist's care. A slate with a wooden frame and the ghost of sums on it. A ribbon with a pin tacked through it like a stitched wound. A bundle of paper tied with string that crumbled when he tugged, so he cut the string with the knife and lifted the paper a leaf at a time. The hand changed from page to page. One wrote in straight lines without looking at the ruling. One in a slow curlicue he could feel the writer hating. Some lines read like games, some like bargains, some like records made in a hurry with someone standing behind the writer counting the seconds left. It comes to the door and scratches. If you hop right, you get to keep your voice. If you hop wrong, you lose something else. We opened the clock and put the time in. It will not let us have it back. On the last page, a set of instructions. When it says your name, do not answer. When it asks to drink, do not pour. When it asks to come in, ask where it is now. It will not say. Adam set the paper down and pressed his palms to his eyes until false stars bloomed behind the lids. The hopscotch grid glowed. The music box lay at the bottom of the trunk. The missing keys post shone from long handling. He lifted the box, turned it on the underside. A maker's name had been scratched out until the wood bore only a white wound. He shook it gently. The cylinder inside gave a single bellic note, a sound so clean it made the air around it feel dirty. He placed it on the table beside the carved words and stood very still. The room held its breath. He turned the post with his fingers. Slow, 6 notches, until the spring inside caught. He set the box down and let go. The melody that crept out was the shape of a lullaby. Amputated Evra, the note had been stolen. What remained was the kind of tune a child gets wrong when they are thinking about something else. The sound might have been a comfort once. In this room, it was an accusation. He closed the lid, and the song died like a moth in a fist. When he lifted the lid again, the box did not resume. He laughed softly. "Good," he said. "Good." He turned to the wall under the bricked window and ran the paint scraper along the plaster there. The surface came away in flour, revealing old score marks. Someone had tried to cut a square, an escape hatch that wouldn't escape to anything but mortar. He worked until the muscles at the base of his thumb burned. He coughed dust and tasted old lath. He made a hole the size of his palm and found nothing behind it but the weight of stone. He sat on the floor and let his head fall back against the skirting. The lantern drew a bright circle and everything outside it became a thought he didn't want. That was when the hopscotch stone button moved. He saw it at the edge of his vision. A tiny shift. A sound like a pearl on wood. The button slid from the first square into the second with the certainty of a practiced move. No breeze, no slant to blame. He stood too fast and the lantern skittered on its base. "No," he said. The word had more air in it than sound. "No games." The button slid to the third square. He stepped over the grid with his legs wide like a man not wanting water to soak his cuffs. He caught the door with his palm and was in the hall before he knew he'd intended to be. He stood there breathing like he'd run the length of the creek and back. Downstairs, the clock under glass ticked twice, as if nodding to an argument it had won. He left the door wide and did not go back for the rest of the day. The house followed him with small sounds of disappointment. The tap that wanted to drip and didn't. A hinge somewhere rehearsing a squeak it would save for later. A gust at the chimney that spoke a syllable and decided to wait for the end of the line. At dusk, he took the ledger page from his pocket and read it for the first time, not as a curiosity, but as a set of laws. He copied the last line into the notebook in a hand so neat it looked foreign. "Do not answer if it speaks your name." He underlined it twice. That night, the whisper came anyway, and because he had spent all day not listening, the sound of his name almost broke him. He bit his tongue hard enough to feel the wet iron of blood. He did not answer. It said his name again and again, until the name was only vowel and breath. He did not answer. When he finally slept, he dreamed he was playing hopscotch with chalk that wrote in water and numbers that changed when he blinked. In the dream, a child's hand held his sleeve the way children do when they want to show you something. The hand was very cold. He woke to find a circle of pale dust on the floor beside the bed the size of a child's palm. The next morning, the house pretended to be ordinary. The kitchen was only a kitchen. The dining room was a room where people had eaten food once. The sitting room's chair was a chair. The clock under glass did not tick. He wrote for 2 hours about a boy who collected first sentences and arranged them in a shoebox. and never looked at the last page of any book. It was the best 2 hours of work he'd done in a year. At noon, the neighbor appeared. He saw her through the smeared front window. The old woman who had drawn her curtain the night he arrived. She stood at the gate with her arms folded, a scarf over her hair despite the day's stillness. He stepped onto the porch and lifted a hand. She did not lift hers. "You opened it," she said. "Not a question." "The door," he admitted. The house behind him seemed to lean in to hear his answer. She looked past him at the upstairs windows. The way you look at water you know is deeper than it looks. "You shouldn't have." "I know," he said, and was surprised at the truth in it. Did you live here?" Her mouth made a small, tight shape. "No one lives here." She glanced down the road as if measuring who else might be watching. "If it asks for water, don't give it. If it asks for names, don't give yours. If it asks to be let in, ask where it is now." "I read that," he said. "He didn't say where." She nodded once, sharp. "Then you'll know enough to leave." He didn't answer. She looked at him for a long time. The way one looks at weather moving in over a field. "The clocks," she said suddenly. "Do they stop?" 2:37, he said before he decided not to. The number left his mouth like a confession. She flinched, as if he'd thrown something at her. "It lights you," she said, and turned away. He almost called after her. He didn't. He stood on the porch until she was a point of gray scarf at the corner, and then a rumor of a person, and then nothing. He went inside and found, on the foyer table, the music box. He had left it in the trunk. He knew he had left it in the trunk. It sat on the notebook like a paperweight. On the lid, someone had pressed 2 small fingerprints into the dust, side by side, and drawn a curve beneath them with a bare fingertip. A child's idea of a smile. He did not touch it. He did not move it. He picked up the notebook underneath with care and let the box slide to the wood. He took the notebook to the kitchen and wrote another 100 words that looked like a man trying to walk with one shoe. At dusk, he turned on the 2 working bulbs and the lantern and the courage he could find. He climbed to the stairs with the music box in his hand, because carrying it felt safer than leaving it alone. The locked room waited at the end of the hall with its door ajar. The way a mouth waits when someone is about to speak. He set the lantern just outside the threshold. He pushed the door open with a finger and let the darkness in the corners arrange itself. The hopscotch grid had new chalk on it, bright strokes across old lines. In the second square, the button waited, unashamed of the laws it obeyed. He crouched and placed the music box at the edge of the grid. "You can have this," he said. "You can have it and leave me alone." He felt foolish at once, and then he didn't. Making bargains with rooms requires a certain kind of humility. He lifted the lid. Nothing happened. He turned the post 3 knots. The box thought about the request, then released its broken lullaby into the boards. From the wall beneath the bricked window, a new sound answered, soft, regular, as if something were tapping the mortar with the pad of a small finger. "Tap it, please," he said, and didn't know who he said it to. He closed the lid. The tapping stopped. He lifted the lid. The tapping resumed, steady as a metronome. He closed it again. Silence. He stood and backed the hall, pulling the door gently until only a wedge of room remained. In that wedge, he saw the button knock itself forward into the third square with the same small certainty as before, as if it had simply been waiting for permission. He closed the door, set the latch, and put his palm flat against the wood until the cold in it took the heat from his hand. Downstairs, the clock under glass ticked once, twice, 3 times, as if counting out steps in a game. He went down to hear it and arrived at the dining room in time for the pendulum to make its last, reluctant half-turn. The hands remained at 2:37. He stood in the doorway a long time. The house stood with him. When he went to bed, he put the ledger page beneath his pillow again. He woke at midnight with it clenched in his fist. The edges had cut his palm. In the morning, the cuts had pressed small white crescents into his skin. He made coffee. He held the warm mug and stared at the wall and said, "I won't open that door again." In the quiet that followed, the house made no sound at all, which was the same as a smile. And somewhere inside the walls of the room at the end of the hall, chalk dragged across wood in a slow, patient hand, finishing a square that had been waiting a very long time. Adam's days lost their edges. He would wake to the gray light seeping through the shutters, boil water for coffee, and write a few hundred words that felt like the echo of someone else's story. By afternoon, the air in the house would thicken, and by evening the whispers would begin again. He told himself he could endure it, that every house had a rhythm and this one was simply harder to learn. But the page beneath his pillow, the hopscotch grid in the locked room, and the music box that moved from place to place on its own, said otherwise. On the 5th morning, he could not pretend anymore. He needed answers. He drove into town, the road seeming longer than it had the first time, the trees leaning closer, their branches tangled like hands clasped over his head. The streets were nearly empty when he arrived, the shops shuttered though it was barely midday. He parked outside the library, the same brick building where he had first seen the file. Inside, the smell of paper and dust hit him like a memory. The librarian with steel gray hair was at her desk again, her pen moving steadily across a ledger. She looked up, recognition sharp in her eyes. "You're still there," she said. Adam nodded. "I need more. Whatever you didn't give me the first time." She pursed her lips. "I gave you all I had." He leaned closer. "No, you gave me what you thought I could handle." His voice cracked. "I can't handle what's happening now unless I know everything." The woman's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, then softened not with kindness but with resignation. She rose from her desk and disappeared into the archives. When she returned, she carried a second file, thinner but heavier in a way that had nothing to do with paper. She set it on the desk between them and tapped it once with her finger. "This isn't supposed to leave the building," she said. "I'll read it here," Adam promised. The file contained clippings so old the ink had bled into the page, photographs that had gone sepia with time, and handwritten notes that looked more like warnings than records. The first article was from 1874. Local mason found dead in Hallow Creek House foundation. The story told of a man who had fallen into the construction pit during the House S building. His body was recovered 3 days later, crushed beneath collapsed stone. Workers whispered that the walls closed on him. Another page from 1897. The family of 5. He had read about them before, but here were the photographs, grainy, black and white images of pale faces, eyes open, all laid out on the floor of the locked room. The door had been sealed from the outside. Neighbors testified they heard laughter that night, though none of the family had been seen alive again. Adam's stomach churned. A clipping from 1910. Child's body found in wall. He had read a summary, but the details were worse. The girl had been missing 4 weeks before her body was discovered bricked into the wall of the upstairs room. Her eyes had been removed. No culprit was ever named. Page after page documented the same cycle. Residents hearing voices, strange laughter, sudden deaths, families disappearing, individuals going mad, strangers drowning themselves in the creek after only days inside. At the bottom of the file was a single sheet, handwritten, no date, no name. The house is not haunted. The house is the haunted. It is a vessel that feeds. It takes children first because they hear more clearly. Then it takes those who listen. Do not stay after the 3rd night. Do not play its games. If you open the door, you are already lost. Adam's hands shook as he set the paper down. Where did this come from? He asked. The librarian did not answer. She was staring at the windows, her face pale. Adam turned. An old man stood outside on the sidewalk, staring in at him through the glass. His eyes were sunken, his skin gray, but his gaze was sharp as a knife. When Adam moved toward the window, the man shook his head slowly, as though warning him. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street without a sound. The librarian whispered, "That was Mr. Carraway. He was born in that house. His family was the one in 1954. He's the only one who ever made it out." Adam pressed his hand against the glass where the man had stood, as though he could still feel the echo of his presence. He knew then that he could not leave without speaking to Carraway. But when he asked where to find him, the librarian shook her head. "You don't find him," she said. "He finds you. If he wants to." Adam drove back to the house with the file heavy in his mind. The whispers began before he reached the porch. Soft, mocking, layered. "You read it. Now you know. But still, you stay." He unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and froze. The music box sat on the floor in the foyer, its lid open, and from inside the walls came the sound of children laughing, louder than ever before. That night, Adam barely slept. The laughter and the walls ebbed only toward dawn, thinning into sighs that rustled the plaster. When he did drift off in the armchair, he dreamed of chalk-dusted hands pushing against his shoulders, of a hopscotch grid that stretched forever, square after square vanishing into dark. He woke to the pale light of morning and a knock at the door. The sound froze him where he sat. No one ever knocked. The neighbors avoided the place. The landlord never visited, and even the mailman left letters at the gate. But this was a knock 3. Deliberate raps on the heavy wood. Adam rose slowly, every nerve buzzing. He opened the door. The old man from the library window stood there, leaning on a cane. His eyes were clouded with age but keen beneath the haze. His clothes were threadbare, his hair white as chalk dust. "You shouldn't have opened it," the man rasped. Adam swallowed. "The room." The old man's gaze flicked upward toward the second floor. "That room doesn't close once it knows you." "Who are you?" Adam asked, though he already knew. "Caraway." The name landed heavy, like the last line of a prayer. "I was a boy when my family lived here. We thought the house was just stone and wood. But the house is a mouth, and mouths feed." He stepped past Adam without waiting for permission, moving with surprising strength for his age. Inside, he looked around as though each corner of the house were an old wound. "My parents lasted 6 months, Caraway said. "They heard the whispers, but thought it was wind. My sisters, they heard more. Laughter, songs. They played games in the upstairs hall. Hopscotch, hide and seek. Then they started talking to someone we couldn't see. They called her the girl behind the wall." Adam felt his stomach twist. "The one they found." "Yes." Caraway's eyes sharpened. "But she wasn't the first. And she wasn't the last. My sisters vanished one night. No doors opened, no windows broken. My parents." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "They joined the house not long after. I don't remember how I survived. I only remember waking in the creek with my lungs full of water. I never went back. Until now." The house groaned above them, a long shudder through the beams. Dust drifted from the chandelier. Caraway's eyes darted upward. "It knows I'm here. It doesn't like me talking to you." Adam's voice cracked. "Then tell me what to do." The old man leaned closer, his breath sour but urgent. "Don't speak when it whispers. Don't play when it asks. And for God's sake, don't drink." Adam stiffened. The glass of water, the command to drink. Caraway's eyes narrowed. "It's already begun with you." Adam's throat tightened. "How do I stop it?" The old man gripped his arm with surprising force. "You don't. You endure. Or you leave. Those are the only choices. Stay too long, and it keeps you." The house groaned again, louder, the sound of wood bending under a weight it could not bear. Caraway released Adam's arm and turned toward the door. "I shouldn't have come," he muttered. "It'll want me again now." He stepped outside into the pale morning. Adam followed, heart racing. Wait. But Caraway was already moving down the road, faster than seemed possible, his cane striking the gravel in quick, sharp beats. By the time Adam reached the gate, the old man was gone. Only the echo of his warning remained, circling in Adam's mind. "Stay too long, and it keeps you." Adam turned back toward the house. Its windows stared at him, black and unblinking. For the first time since arriving, he wished he had never come. But when he stepped back inside, the music box was waiting for him again, lid open, its broken lullaby winding faintly through the air. And in the walls, the children laughed louder than ever. By the 6th night, The house stopped pretending. It no longer creaked like old wood or whispered like drafts through the walls. It spoke. It laughed. It shifted around him as though the very bones of its structure were bending to a game only it knew. Adam sat at the table in the sitting room, the ledger page flat before him, the music box beside it. He hadn't wound the box, hadn't touched the page, but both seemed alive in the lantern light. The box's lid rose an inch on its own, then fell shut. The page fluttered as if a breeze had crossed it, though the windows were sealed tight. Then the clock under glass ticked, not once, not twice, but in rhythm slow, deliberate beats, as if keeping time to a song only the house could hear. The whispers joined in. 1, 2, 3. Children's voices, counting. A game had begun. Adam's breath came fast. He stood, backing toward the door. But the doorway had changed Narawa. The walls inching closer, pressing like a throat. He forced himself through and stumbled into the foyer. The chandelier swung violently. Though no air stirred, the staircase stretched higher than it should, the landing disappearing into darkness. And then the laughter came. It poured down the stairs, layered and endless, until Adam clapped his hands over his ears. But the sound wasn't in his ears, it was in his chest, his bones, his blood. "Stop," he shouted. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then the voice came. Not a whisper this time. Not many voices tangled together. One voice, deep, resonant, filling the house as though the walls themselves had learned to speak. "You opened the door, Adam. Now you play." He fled to the kitchen, gasping for air. The faucet dripped steadily, though he hadn't turned it. A glass sat on the counter, full to the brim with water. He knocked it aside. It shattered on the floor, spilling clear liquid that seeped between the tiles. The whisper slithered close behind his ear. "Thirsty?" Adam screamed, kicking the shards away. He grabbed the hammer from the shed and swung it wildly at the walls. Plaster cracked. Dust rained down, but the laughter rose louder, shaking the windows in their frames. The lights flickered. For a heartbeat, the house changed. The kitchen elongated, counters stretching into the dark. The table grew longer, chairs scraping into place as if unseen guests had just arrived. Shapes filled them, faint, translucent, but their hollow faces turned toward him, eyes empty sockets, mouths frozen in grotesque smiles. At the head of the table sat the doll. No longer cracked, no longer small. Its porcelain face was whole, gleaming in the dim light, its glass eyes fixed on him, its head tilted once, slow and deliberate. The deep voice rumbled again. "Your turn." The hopscotch stone clinked against the floor at his feet. Adam looked down. There, etched into the kitchen tiles, was the grid. Clear, perfect, every square filled with fresh chalk lines that hadn't been there a moment before. The button lay in the first square, waiting. He backed away, shaking his head. "No, no, I won't." The chandelier in the dining hall crashed to the floor, shards scattering like teeth. The shadows around the walls surged forward, clawing at the edges of the light. The whispers rose into screams. "Play! Play! Play!" The button slid into the second square on its own. Adam dropped the hammer and bolted for the front door. But when he reached it, the door had no knob, no handle, no hinges, just a blank wall of wood, smooth and seamless. Behind him, the children laughed. The game had already begun. He ran upstairs, driven by panic, though he knew the danger was greater above. The hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Each one stood slightly open, each one whispering his name. Adam. Adam. He staggered past them, covering his ears. Shadows reached from the thresholds like arms, brushing his shoulders, tangling around his ankles. The air thickened until every breath was a gasp through water. At the end of the hall, the locked room stood wide open. The hopscotch grid glowed faintly on the floor, chalk lines shimmering like moonlight. The button waited in the third square. The doll stood in the far corner, its head tilted, lips stretched into a smile that showed tiny, porcelain teeth. Adam froze in the doorway, shaking. His chest heaved. The voice filled the room again, low and inescapable. "One more night, Adam. That's all you have." The button slid forward into the fourth square. Adam screamed, turned, and fled back down the hall. Doors slammed shut behind him one by one, the sound like gunshots, until only the foyer remained. He stumbled down the stairs and collapsed against the wall, sobbing. The house groaned, satisfied. The whispers quieted. The button rolled back to the first square. The game had only just begun. The hours that followed bent and broke like warped glass. Adam could no longer tell when it was night or day. Every clock in the house was frozen at 2:37, yet he felt the drag of time in his bones, the ache of sleeplessness pulling at his skin. The game never stopped. He would walk into the parlor only to find himself in the dining hall. He would climb a staircase that stretched upward for 20 steps, 30, 40 only, to stumble back into the foyer, breathless and shaking. Corridors looped in impossible circles, doors opening into rooms he had never seen before, each one stranger than the last. One room was filled with mirrors, their glass cracked and cloudy, but every reflection showed him older, weaker eyes, sunken, hair gone white. Another held toys scattered across the floor marbles, dolls, blocks, all of them vibrating faintly as though 100 invisible hands had just dropped them at once. A third room was filled entirely with water up to his knees, the surface perfectly still. Yet when he looked down, he saw not his reflection but faces staring back, mouths open in silent screams. The whispers followed him everywhere. Hop, skip, don't fall, Adam. Each word was playful, taunting, threaded with laughter that seemed to come from children hiding just out of sight. Once, in the hall, he caught movement. Small shapes darted across the floor, fast as shadows, giggling as they vanished through the walls. He pressed his back to the plaster and felt it thrum beneath him like a heartbeat. The house wasn't just alive, it was awake. He tried to fight. He smashed furniture, hurled chairs, tore at the wallpaper until his hands bled. Behind the paper were messages carved deep into the wood. Don't play. It cheats. We lost. One name was carved over and over again, in dozens of hands, dozens of sizes. Anna, 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 Anna. The girl in the wall. Adam's stomach turned. He staggered back, pressing his palm against the scarred boards, as if to feel the truth beneath them. The wood was cold, too cold. From behind the wall, a faint knock answered. 3 times. Dop, 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 dop. Adam stumbled away, choking on his own breath. By what felt like the 10th night, his mind frayed. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He would jolt awake wherever he collapsed in the foyer, in the hall. Once even in the locked room itself, though he swore he had never gone inside. Each time, the hopscotch grid was closer, clearer, its chalk lines unbroken. The button always waited. He began to dream while awake. Voices spoke to him in daylight, urging him to play. His name appeared scratched into the condensation of the kitchen window. Once, he found it written in the dust across the piano keys. And through it all, the doll moved. Sometimes he found it sitting on the dining room table, sometimes at the top of the stairs, once even propped against the armchair where he had first slept. Always upright, always watching. Its porcelain face had changed to more human now. The cracks sealed, the eyes brighter, its lips curved into the faintest smile. He tried throwing it into the creek behind the house. He hurled it as far as his arm allowed, watching it vanish into the water. He staggered back inside, triumphant, but when he entered the foyer, the doll was waiting at the base of the stairs. Dry, perfect, smiling. The house shifted again. The walls pulsed faintly, the floor breathing beneath his feet. The whispers rose into chants, rhythmic, inescapable. Play, play, play. Adam's strength broke. He sank to his knees, sobbing, clutching his head. "I won't," he shouted. "I won't play your game." Silence fell. For a moment, the house seemed to listen. The whispers quieted. The air stilled. Then the deep voice filled every corner, every wall, every crack in the foundation. "One more night, Adam. One more." Chant. The hopscotch stone clinked against the floor at his feet. When he looked down, it was already in the first square. And faintly, almost kindly, the children's voices sang together. "Your turn." Adam staggered through the night in terror, each room a new trick, each hallway a new maze. The house pulsed and shifted until he no longer knew where he was. He screamed until his throat tore, begged until his voice broke. But the game continued. By Donner, what he thought was done. The hopscotch grid stretched across every floor of the house, in the parlor, in the kitchen, in the upstairs hall. No matter where he turned, the button was waiting in the first square. And always, the doll watched, when at last he collapsed on the foyer floor, sobbing. The laughter swelled one final time. The voices overlapped, layered, crashing into him like a tide. One more night, one more chance. Then your hour. The house exhaled, and every candle, every lantern, every light died at once. Darkness swallowed him whole. The house no longer waited until night to show its hunger. By the time Adam opened his eyes, the whisper was already there, curling inside his skull like smoke. It no longer needed the walls, no longer needed the dark. It lived in him now, humming beneath every thought. One more night. He stumbled from the foyer into the kitchen. The windows no longer showed the yard or the creek. Instead, Every pane revealed the same thing. A chalk grid, squares stretching into infinity. The hopscotch game unending. When he pressed his hand to the glass, the chalk dusted his fingers, real and dry. The faucet dripped. On the counter, another glass waited, filled to the brim. He shoved it to the floor. It shattered, spilling water that smelled faintly of earth. From the shards, children's voices giggled. Adam staggered back, chest heaving. "I won't," he whispered. Though his voice had no strength left, the deep voice filled the kitchen, rolling through his bones. "You already are." He tried to run. The hallway lengthened, stretching into impossible distance. Doors appeared on either side, each one ajar, each one whispering his name. He forced himself not to look, but from the corner of his eye he saw them. Pale faces peering out, hands pressing against the gaps, lips mouthing his name in silence. The stairs twisted upward like a spine. He climbed until his legs shook, but every landing brought him back to the locked room door. No matter which way he turned, it was always waiting, knob dark, frame scarred. This time, the door stood wide open. Inside, the hopscotch grid glowed white against the floorboards. The button rested in the fifth square. The doll stood beyond it, taller now, its porcelain face more human, its smile too wide. Its eyes gleamed like wet glass. "Come play," it said, its voice the layered chorus of every whisper he had heard since arriving. Adam shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No. The button rolled into the sixth square on its own. The doll stepped closer. Its porcelain feet struck the boards with hollow clicks, the sound of bone against wood. "You opened the door," it said. "Now you've finished the game." The voices rose all around him, children laughing, women sobbing, men groaning in agony. They overlapped into a cacophony until Adam's mind threatened to split. He pressed his palms to his ears, screaming, "Stoppi!" Everything froze. The voices cut off. The doll stood motionless. Even the dust in the air hung still. Then, from the bricked window above, came a sound he hadn't heard before. A small, thin voice. "A child's help me." The words cracked something inside him. Against every promise he had made himself, he answered, "I hear you." The house roared. The hopscotch grid blazed with white light. The button shot into the final square, clattering against the boards. The doll's grin split wider, porcelain cracking, revealing blackness beneath. Adam tried to run, but the floor gave way beneath his feet. He plunged into darkness, the screams of the house swallowing him whole. He landed hard in the dining hall. The long table was set, every chair filled with figures gray, hollow-eyed, their skin cracked like old porcelain, their heads turned toward him in perfect unison. At the head of the table sat the doll, now the size of a man, its porcelain face smooth and gleaming, its smile fixed. It lifted a hand and pointed at him. "Sit." Hands gripped his arms, cold and unyielding. He struggled, but dozens of figures dragged him forward, shoving him into the chair nearest the doll. The wood bit into his back. The doll leaned closer. Its breath was ice. "One more night, Adam. Forever night." The figures laughed, the sound hollow and endless. The chandelier overhead blazed with sickly yellow light. The walls pulsed as though the house itself was breathing faster. excited, alive. Flooded, its pages fluttered open on their own. Words scrawled across the paper in black ink that wasn't his. "You belong to us," Adam screamed, slamming the notebook shut. "No, I won't. I'm not yours." The doll's head tilted, glass eyes narrowing. "You answered." The words struck harder than any blow. He realized too, late the child's voice, the plea for help. That was the trap. By answering, he had given himself away. The voices swelled into a deafening chorus. "You answered. You answered. You answered." The figures closed in, pressing against him from all sides, their skin cracked, flakes of gray falling like ash. Their mouths opened wide and black, swallowing his screams. The doll raised its hand. Silence fell. "You take their place now," it said. The figures released him, one by one. They dissolved into dust, their forms crumbling, vanishing into the cracks of the floor. The chairs sat empty, the long table bare. Only Adam remained, bound in silence. The chandelier flickered once and died. When the lights returned, he was no longer sitting. He was standing at the head of the table. The doll was gone. The chairs were filled again, but this time with new faces. Faces pale, terrified, watching him. He tried to move, tried to speak, but his lips stretched into a smile not his own. His skin hardened, cold spreading through his body. His vision blurred until everything looked like porcelain. The whispers rose inside him, filling his skull, pouring from his mouth without his will. One more night. Weeks later, neighbors passing the house swore they saw a man in the upstairs window, pale, still, smiling. At night, the house was no longer silent. It whispered. It laughed. And when the wind was right, it carried a new voice. With it a man's voice, hoarse and broken, echoing through the stone walls. "Help me." The house had a new keeper, and the game had just begun again. Thank you for staying until the very end of the house that never sleeps. If this story chilled you to the bone, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more long horror narrations. And never forget, when a house whispers your name, don't answer. Because some games never end.